The darkness swallowed them whole as Blake Morrison pressed his back against the cold stone wall, his left shoulder burning where the bullet had torn through flesh and muscle. Blood soaked through his jacket in warm pulses he could feel, but not see. Courage stood rigid between him and the tunnel entrance, the German shepherd's low growl vibrating through the suffocating blackness like a warning from something primal and unstoppable. Behind them, flashlight beams sliced through the ancient corridors of the forgotten fortress, accompanied by the crunch of boots on gravel and the metallic click of weapons being readied. A voice echoed off the limestone walls, cold and assured. "You cannot run forever, Morrison. This mountain will be your grave." Blake felt Courage's fur bristle against his leg, sensed the coiled tension in every muscle of the dog, who had already taken one bullet meant for him, somewhere in the howling wind that screamed through hidden vents in the rock. Blake heard the ghosts of soldiers who had died. Here nearly 150 years ago, their secrets buried, until a retired combat engineer and his rescue dog had stumbled into a conspiracy that powerful men would kill to protect. The beam of light grew brighter, closer, and Blake knew they had perhaps 60 seconds before the decision would be made. For them, fight or die in the earth that had kept its silence for so long. How did it come to this, he wondered, his hand finding the thick fur of Courage's neck, the only warmth in a world of stone and shadow and approaching death. 3 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been whether the coffee would brew before his nightmares woke him. Now he stood in a place that should not exist, hunted by men who dealt in violence, as casually as other men dealt cards, with only a dog between him and the kind of ending that never makes the news. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. 3 weeks before that moment in the dark, Blake Morrison woke at dawn, in his cabin at the base of the Cascade Range, gasping from a dream where the sand was red and the air tasted like copper and smoke. He lay still, waiting for his heart to slow, waiting for the present to override the past. The cabin was silent except for the soft padding of paws on wooden floorboards, and then Courage was there beside the bed, the 4-year-old German shepherd placing his massive head on the mattress, dark eyes watching with an understanding that required no words. Blake reached out, fingers sinking into the thick fur, and the dog pressed closer. His warmth and steady breathing a kind of anchor Blake had not known he needed until 8 months ago when he walked into that rescue shelter and saw a dog who looked like he had seen too much, just like Blake had seen too much. They told him at the shelter that Courage had been found abandoned, malnourished, with scars that suggested abuse, a past no one could fully reconstruct. Blake did not care about the details. He recognized a fellow survivor when he saw one. He had spent over 2 decades in the army, most of it with the combat engineers, the ones who went in first to clear the bombs and the booby traps, who built bridges under fire and demolished enemy fortifications while people shot at them. It was not the kind of work that left you unchanged. When he finally retired and bought this isolated cabin 30 miles from the nearest town, he thought he wanted solitude, space to quiet the noise that never quite left his head. What he found instead was loneliness, the dangerous kind that made the nightmares worse, and the days feel like waiting rooms for nothing in particular. Then came Courage, and suddenly Blake had a reason to get up, to walk, to stay present in a world that often felt like it was separated from him by thick glass. Courage was not like other dogs. Blake noticed this early. The German shepherd had instincts that seemed almost supernatural, a sensitivity to things Blake could not perceive. On their daily walks through the dense pine forests that climbed toward the rocky ridges above, Courage would stop at certain places, his entire body going still, ears swiveling, nose lifted to air currents Blake could not feel. The dog would stare toward the north, toward the part of the mountain where the cliffs rose sheer and forbidding, where even the local hunters avoided because the terrain was too treacherous and the caves too deep and unmapped. At first, Blake assumed it was just animal instinct, maybe the scent of deer or bear, the normal prey drive of a working breed. But it happened too consistently, always in the same general direction, and always with the same intensity. A low rumble in Courage's throat that was not quite a growl, more like a question the dog was asking of something Blake could not see. Blake had learned in the army to trust the people around him when they sensed danger, even if he could not see it himself. He decided to extend that same trust to Courage. If the dog was trying to tell him something, maybe it was time to listen. The bond between them had grown strong, built on those quiet mornings when Blake woke from nightmares and found the dog already awake, watching over him, and on those long afternoons when they walked for hours in silence. Two damaged souls finding peace in each other's company. It was on a Tuesday morning, the air thick with autumn fog that turned the trees into gray phantoms, when Courage made his move. They had been walking the usual trail, a deer path that wound through old-growth timber, when the dog suddenly pulled hard on the leash, veering off the established route toward a section of forest Blake had never explored. Blake called him back once, twice, but Courage ignored him completely, something the dog never did. There was urgency in the way he moved, purpose, and Blake made a decision in that moment to follow. They pushed through underbrush, climbed over fallen logs slick with moss, descended into a ravine where the fog was so thick Blake could barely see 10 feet ahead. Courage moved with absolute confidence, and Blake followed, his combat engineer training making him automatically note the terrain, the way water had carved channels in the volcanic rock, the unusual regularity of certain stone formations that seemed almost but not quite natural. Then Courage stopped, began digging frantically at the base of an ancient fir tree, dirt flying between his back legs. Blake knelt beside him, used his hands to clear away layers of decomposed needles and soil, and his fingers touched something hard, cold, metallic. He pulled it free, brushed off the dirt, and felt his breath catch. It was a military medal, tarnished green with age but unmistakable, the kind issued in the 1870s, with a ribbon that had long since rotted away, and an engraving on the back that Blake could barely make out. A date, 1877, and initials he could not read. Blake sat back on his heels, turning the medal over in his hands, while Courage sat beside him, panting slightly, watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. 1877, Blake thought, his mind immediately jumping to what he knew of regional history, the Nez Perce War, the flight of Chief Joseph's people through this very area, the army units that pursued them. But there were no records of forts this far into the mountains, no battles documented in this specific location. So what was a military medal from that era doing buried here, miles from any known historical site, in a place that seemed deliberately chosen for its remoteness and inaccessibility? Courage whined softly, nosed at Blake's hand, then looked back toward the deeper forest, toward the cliffs that rose in the distance like broken teeth. Blake felt something he had not felt in years, real curiosity, the kind that pulled at him like a hook in the chest, the sense that he had stumbled onto something that mattered, something hidden. He looked at the dog, at the medal, at the fog swirling through the trees like the breath of ghosts, and made a decision that would change everything. They would find out what this was, where it came from, and what it meant. Blake spent the next 2 days researching the medal, starting with online databases of military history that left him more confused than enlightened. The date kept pulling him back. 1877, the year of the Nez Perce War, when Chief Joseph led his people on a desperate flight toward Canada, pursued by multiple army columns through Idaho, Montana, and Yellowstone, finally surrendering just short of the border. But the standard histories said nothing about military installations in the remote sections of eastern Oregon, nothing about secret forts or hidden outposts in the Cascade Range, nothing that would explain what he had found. Blake needed local knowledge, the kind that lived in small-town libraries and the memories of people whose families had been here for generations. He drove the 30 miles to the nearest town, a place called Millerton, Population 800. The kind of settlement that existed primarily as a way station between larger places. The library was a single room in the back of the town hall, shelves packed with donated books and a few filing cabinets stuffed with local records. Behind the desk sat a woman perhaps in her late 30s, dark hair pulled back, wearing a flannel shirt and reading glasses that she lowered when Blake walked in. She looked at him with the particular kind of attention small-town people reserve for strangers, friendly but assessing. Blake introduced himself, explained he lived up in the mountains, and asked if there were any historical records about military activity in the area during the 1870s. The woman, who introduced herself as Felicia Granger, literally sat up straighter, her entire demeanor shifting from polite librarian to intensely interested historian. "You have no idea how rare it is for someone to ask me that question," she said. And for the first time in days, Blake felt like he was on the right track. Felicia Granger was not just a librarian. Blake learned quickly. She held a master's degree in Western American history, had published several articles in regional journals, and was working on a book about forgotten military installations from the Indian Wars period. More importantly, she had a personal connection to the history she studied. Her grandmother had been Nez Perce, from a family that survived the war and the subsequent forced relocations, and Felicia had grown up hearing stories that did not quite match the official histories, tales of soldiers who helped rather than hunted, of secret places where sacred objects were hidden, of alliances that were never recorded because they would have been considered treason by both sides. When Blake showed her the medal, Felicia held it with a reverence that surprised him, turning it over slowly, her fingers tracing the engraved date. "This is from the 7th Infantry," she said quietly. "They were part of Colonel Howard's column during the pursuit. But they should never have been this far west. The accepted route of the chase goes through Idaho into Montana, nowhere near here." She looked up at Blake, her eyes bright with the kind of excitement historians get when facing genuine mystery. "There have always been rumors," she continued, "stories passed down in my family and a few other old families in the region, about a place my grandmother called the Stone That Speaks, a hidden fortress built by soldiers who wanted to protect rather than destroy, who helped some of the Nez Perce hide their most sacred artifacts before they were forced onto reservations where everything would have been confiscated or destroyed by missionaries." Blake felt the pieces beginning to assemble in his mind, not a complete picture yet, but the edges of something significant. Over the next week, Blake and Courage began systematic explorations of the area where the medal was found, with Blake mapping terrain and Courage doing what German shepherds do best, following scent trails invisible to human senses. Blake had read enough about tracking dogs to know that Courage's ability was extraordinary even for the breed. German shepherds can detect scents that are days or even weeks old, can distinguish between dozens of different smells in a single air sample, can follow a specific trail through contaminated areas where other scents cross and confuse. What made Courage different was his focus, the way he could lock onto something and refuse to be distracted, working methodically through an area as if following a map only he could see. They encountered Sam Chen on the 4th day of searching, an older man with weathered Asian features and the kind of lean build that comes from decades of physical labor outdoors. Sam was cutting deadfall timber near one of the ridges Blake and Courage had been exploring, and when he saw them, he stopped working, leaned on his axe, and watched them approach with an expression Blake recognized from his military days, the look of someone who knows more than they are saying. Blake introduced himself, mentioned he was exploring the area, kept it vague. Sam nodded slowly, said he had worked these forests for 30 years, knew every trail and most of what happened in them. When Blake asked about local history, about old structures or ruins, Sam's face closed down subtly, not hostile but guarded. His advice was simple and direct. "Some things are left alone for good reasons," he said. "Some history is better staying buried, especially when powerful people have interests in keeping it that way." Then he picked up his axe and went back to work. But Blake noticed Sam's eyes followed them as they walked away. and noticed too that Courage kept looking back at the man, head tilted, as if trying to solve a puzzle. That night in his cabin, Blake could not sleep, his mind cycling through what he knew and what he sensed. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling while Courage slept on the floor beside the bed, the dogs breathing deep and steady. Blake had spent his career in situations where information was incomplete, where you had to make decisions based on fragments and intuition, where the difference between right and wrong choices could be measured in lives saved or lost. He felt that same weight now, the sense that he was standing at a decision point whose consequences he could not yet see. His thoughts turned to why this mattered so much to him, why he could not just let it go, turn the medal over to some historical society, and go back to his quiet, isolated existence. The answer, he realized, had to do with Courage, with the way the dog had led him to something that needed finding, with the sense that they were meant to do this together. Since leaving the army, Blake had felt adrift, purposeless, going through motions of living without any real direction. Courage had given him a reason to get up each day. But this was something more, a mission that required the skills he had spent decades developing, a chance to matter again in a way that felt true. He reached down, rested his hand on Courage's head, felt the dog stir and press against his palm. Whatever they found, wherever this led, they would face it together. And that thought brought Blake more peace than he had felt in years. 2 weeks after finding the medal, Courage led Blake to the cave entrance. They had been following a game trail that wound along the base of a cliff face, the autumn air cold enough that their breath made clouds, when Courage suddenly veered off the path and began pawing at a thick tangle of brush and fallen branches. Blake helped him clear the debris, working carefully, his engineer's training making him cautious about disturbing anything that might be structurally significant. Behind the brush was an opening in the rock, not natural, but carved, the edges too straight and deliberate to be erosion. Blake used his flashlight to peer inside, saw worked stone, steps carved into living rock, walls that showed tool marks. His heart rate picked up. This was not a natural cave. This was excavated, built, intentional. He took photos with his phone, noted the GPS coordinates, then carefully replaced the brush. He needed to come back with proper equipment, and he needed to tell Felicia what they had found. But as he and Courage hiked back toward the cabin, Blake noticed something that made his combat instincts flare. On a tree about 50 yards from the cave entrance, partially hidden behind bark, was a small camera with a solar panel, the kind used for wildlife monitoring. Except this one was aimed not at the forest floor where animals would pass, but directly at the cave entrance. Someone else knew about this place, someone with resources and interest enough to monitor it. Blake kept walking, did not change his pace or look directly at the camera again, but his mind was racing through implications. Whoever set up that camera now had footage of him and Courage at the entrance, which meant they had lost the advantage of secrecy. The game, whatever it was, had just changed, and Blake needed to move faster than he had planned. Blake called Felicia that evening, told her what they had found. She arrived at his cabin before dawn the next morning, bringing her own camera, notebook, and a backpack full of research materials. They drove as far as the logging road allowed, then hiked the rest of the way with Courage ranging ahead, alert and focused. At the cave entrance, with the brush cleared away, Blake could see more details. The opening was perhaps 5 feet high and 4 feet wide, the carved stone weathered but unmistakable. Inside, the passage descended at a gentle angle, the walls still showing chisel marks, small alcoves carved at intervals that would have held torches or lanterns. They moved slowly, documenting everything, and after about 100 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber. Blake swept his flashlight beam across walls covered with carvings, a mix of military insignia and symbols Felicia immediately recognized as Nez Perce, the kind of pictographs that told stories and marked sacred places. She moved closer, her hand trembling as she touched the stone, and Blake saw tears running down her face. "My grandmother told me about this," Felicia whispered, "about soldiers who understood that what was happening was wrong, who helped hide the sacred bundles and medicine objects before the cavalry could destroy them." She described it exactly like this: walls where two worlds met. But Felicia's wonder turned to concern when Blake showed her what else he had found during his initial sweep. Footprints in the dust that were recent within the last few weeks, and more troubling small holes drilled into the rock near the ceiling, the kind where surveillance equipment could be mounted. Someone was not just monitoring the entrance. They had been inside, were possibly watching them right now. Blake pulled Felicia back, spoke quietly, told her about the camera outside. They needed to leave, needed to think about what they were dealing with. But Felicia insisted on taking more photos, on documenting the symbols while they had the chance. As they worked, Courage began to growl, a low, continuous rumble that Blake had learned meant immediate danger. Blake turned off his flashlight, motioned for Felicia to do the same, and in the sudden darkness they heard it, footsteps echoing from deeper in the cave system, coming closer. Someone else was inside the fortress, and they were no longer alone. Blake grabbed Felicia's arm, pulled her close, whispered directly into her ear to move slowly back toward the entrance without making sound. Courage pressed against Blake's leg, the dog's body vibrating with tension but holding position, trained instincts overriding the urge to growl louder. They took 3 careful steps backward before a voice cut through the darkness, male and authoritative, echoing off the stone walls in a way that made it impossible to judge distance. "You might as well stop right there," the voice said. "I know exactly where you are, and you have nowhere to go." Blake's hand moved instinctively to his belt, checking for the knife he carried when hiking. A small blade, but better than nothing. The flashlight beam from deeper in the cave swung toward them, momentarily blinding, and Blake used those seconds to pull Felicia behind a stone outcropping, putting himself between her and whoever was approaching. The beam steadied, and 2 figures emerged into the chamber. Both men, both carrying powerful LED lanterns and wearing expensive outdoor gear that looked too clean for people who regularly spent time in caves. The first man was perhaps 50, thick-built with the kind of groomed appearance that suggested money and time spent maintaining it. He moved with casual confidence, like someone accustomed to being obeyed. The second man was younger, leaner, with cold eyes and the fluid movements of someone trained in violence. Blake recognized the type from his military days, private security or worse, the kind of contractor who did jobs regular police could not or would not do. The older man stopped about 15 feet away, smiled without warmth, and spoke again in that same measured tone. "My name is Ian Blackwood," he said, "and I own the land you are currently trespassing on, along with about 6,000 acres surrounding it. This particular site is part of a confidential archaeological survey I have commissioned, which means your presence here is not only illegal, but potentially damaging to important historical research." Blake did not move, did not respond, his mind processing the situation with the kind of cold, analytical clarity that combat had trained into him. Ian Blackwood. The name meant nothing to Blake personally, but the way the man carried himself, the expensive gear, the hired muscle, all pointed to someone with serious resources and motivation to protect whatever interest he had here. Felicia started to speak, but Blake squeezed her arm in warning. "Stay quiet. Let this play out. Gather information." Ian's smile widened slightly, as if Blake's silence pleased him. "I know who you are, Mr. Morrison," Ian continued. "Retired Army combat engineer, purchased the cabin on Ridgeline Road 8 months ago. Live alone except for your dog. You have had some difficulties adjusting to civilian life, spent time in counseling through VA services, typical PTSD symptoms, nightmares, social isolation, the standard package." Blake felt his jaw tighten, the invasion of privacy deliberate, designed to demonstrate power and knowledge, to make him feel exposed. Ian gestured casually toward Felicia, and Miss Granger, amateur historian, librarian, vocal advocate for Native American land rights, granddaughter of a Nez Perce woman who married into the Granger family in the 1950s. You have been researching this area for years, publishing articles that frankly no one reads, chasing stories your grandmother filled your head with. Ian's tone was conversational, but the message was clear. I know everything about you. You are not special. You are not a threat. The younger man, the one Blake had identified as Muscle, shifted his weight slightly, hand resting on his belt near where Blake could now see the outline of a holster. Ian noticed Blake's attention, smiled again. This is Brock Martinez, Ian said. Former Marine, actually. I am sure you two have that in common. He helps me with security concerns. And right now, you two represent a significant security concern. Felicia found her voice, stepped out from behind Blake despite his attempt to hold her back. This is not your land, she said, her voice shaking but determined. The historical records show this entire section was ceded to the Nez Perce tribe in 1855, then illegally confiscated after the war. The title has never been properly resolved. Ian laughed, actually laughed, the sound bouncing off the cave walls. Miss Granger, he said, I have lawyers who specialize in exactly these kinds of historical land disputes. I have title insurance companies that have reviewed every deed and transfer going back to statehood, and I have possession, which, as they say, is 9/10 of the law. What I also have is a very lucrative development plan for this region, a high-end resort and conference center that will bring jobs and revenue to an economically depressed area, a plan that certain local politicians are very enthusiastic about, a plan that would be significantly complicated if some forgotten cave system were suddenly declared a protected historical site. Blake understood now. The real stakes. This was not about history or heritage. It was about money. About development rights worth millions. About someone who had invested significant resources and would not tolerate interference. Ian's expression hardened, the friendly mask dropping. So here is what is going to happen, he said. You are going to give me every photograph you took, every note you made, every piece of evidence you collected from this site. You are going to sign confidentiality agreements my lawyers will provide, agreements with penalties that will financially destroy you if you violate them. And then you are going to forget this place exists, go back to your isolated little lives, and stay out of matters that do not concern you. If you do this, we all walk away. No harm done. If you refuse, well, these mountains are dangerous. People have accidents, get lost, fall from cliffs, especially people who go wandering in unstable cave systems. They should have left alone. The threat was delivered calmly, almost regretfully, which made it more chilling than if Ian had shouted. Blake felt courage press harder against his leg, the dog's body coiled like a spring, waiting for a command to act. Blake's mind raced through options, none of them good. They were deep in a cave system with only one exit they knew about, facing two men, one of whom was armed and trained. Fighting was possible, but risky, especially with Felicia here, especially without knowing if there were others outside. Compliance meant giving up everything they had found, letting Ian bury the truth along with the artifacts and the history, letting injustice win because it had more money and lawyers. Blake had spent his entire adult life following orders, trusting chain of command, believing systems would work if you worked within them. But he had also seen those systems fail, seen good people destroyed by bureaucracy and corruption, seen truth matter less than power. He looked at Felicia, saw her face set with determination despite the fear in her eyes, saw someone who had spent her life trying to reclaim a heritage stolen from her family. He thought about Sam Chen's warning, about powerful people with interests in keeping history buried. He thought about courage, about the way the dog had led him here, about the sense that this mattered in ways beyond logic or safety. Blake made his decision. He looked directly at Ian Blackwood, kept his voice level and calm. No, Blake said simply. Ian's expression went cold, the last pretense of civility vanishing. Excuse me, he said quietly. Blake repeated it, firmer this time. No. We are not giving you anything. We are not signing anything. And we are not forgetting what we found here. You want to threaten me with accidents and lawyers? Go ahead. But I spent 20 years in situations where people tried to kill me with actual weapons. And I am still here. So your posturing does not impress me much. Ian stared at Blake for a long moment, then nodded slowly to Brock. The younger man's hand moved toward his holster, and Blake felt time slow down the way it always did before violence started. That crystalline moment where every detail became sharp and clear. Blake moved fast, not toward the men, but sideways, pushing Felicia back toward a side passage he had noticed earlier, yelling for Courage to follow. Brock pulled his weapon, but Blake was already behind cover, the sound of a gunshot impossibly loud in the enclosed space, the bullet sparking off rock where Blake had been standing a second before. Courage did not follow Blake. Instead, the dog launched himself directly at Brock, 80 pounds of trained aggression moving with terrifying speed. Brock tried to swing his gun around, but Courage hit him chest high, teeth finding the forearm of his gun hand, and Brock screamed, dropping the weapon. Ian scrambled backward, yelling for Brock to control the dog, his voice high with panic. Blake used the confusion to grab Felicia's hand and run deeper into the cave system, away from the main entrance, into tunnels they had not yet explored. Behind them, he could hear Brock cursing, heard Ian shouting orders, heard Courage's snarls and the sound of a struggle. Blake's heart screamed at him to go back for the dog, but his training overrode emotion. Get the civilian to safety first, then reassess. Courage could handle himself for now. They ran blind through darkness, Blake using his flashlight sparingly to avoid giving away their position, taking turns randomly, trying to create distance and confusion. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Blake pulled Felicia into a small alcove, killed the light completely, and they stood gasping for breath in absolute darkness. From somewhere behind and above them, they could hear voices echoing, Ian and Brock searching, calling out threats and promises. Then another sound made Blake's blood run cold, Courage barking, not the aggressive attack bark, but the high-pitched yelp of pain. Felicia grabbed Blake's arm, felt him tense. "We have to go back," she whispered. But Blake shook his head, forced himself to think tactically. If they had Courage, they would use him as leverage, which meant Blake needed to stay free, needed to find another way out, or another advantage. He pulled out his phone, saw no signal this deep in the cave, but the GPS was still tracking. He took a screenshot of their location, then started moving again, searching for a way that led up rather than down, toward surface and air and possible escape. They found a passage that climbed steeply, carved steps worn smooth by ancient feet or water, and followed it upward for what felt like forever. Blake's shoulder ached where he had slammed it against rock during the run. His breathing was labored from altitude and exertion, but he kept moving, kept Felicia moving. The passage narrowed, became a squeeze where they had to turn sideways. Blake went first to test it, made it through, helped pull Felicia after him. On the other side, the passage opened into another chamber, this one with a feature that made Blake stop dead. In the center of the room, a stone bridge, maybe 3 feet wide and 20 feet long, spanned a chasm so deep Blake's flashlight beam did not reach the bottom. On the far side, he could see another tunnel entrance, possibly leading toward different part of the cave system, or even another exit. But the bridge... Blake approached it carefully, examined the stone with his engineer's eye. It was old, incredibly old, and cracked. A long fissure running down the center that suggested structural failure was not a possibility, but a certainty. Just a matter of when. He tested it with one foot, felt it shift slightly under his weight. Behind them, voices were getting closer. Ian and Brock had found their trail. Felicia looked at the bridge, looked at Blake, her face pale in the harsh LED light. "We do not have a choice, do we?" she said, and Blake shook his head. "One at a time," he said. "Move fast, but do not run. Stay to the edges where the stone is thickest." Felicia went first. Blake watched her move across. each step careful and measured, saw the bridge flex and dust fall from the cracks. But she made it to the other side. Blake took a breath, stepped onto the bridge, felt the stone groan under his weight. He was halfway across when he heard the voices emerge into the chamber behind him, heard Ian shout his name. Blake looked back, saw Ian and Brock at the entrance, saw them raise their flashlights and spot him on the bridge, saw Brock raise his gun again, and Blake did the only thing he could. He ran. The bridge held for 3 steps. 4. And then Blake felt it drop beneath him, heard the massive crack of stone breaking, and he was falling. His hand shot out, fingers finding the edge of the far side, his body slamming into the rock wall with force that drove the air from his lungs. He hung there, feet dangling over darkness, the broken bridge pieces tumbling into the abyss below, with sounds that took long seconds to reach bottom. Felicia was screaming his name, reaching for him, her hands closing around his wrist. Blake tried to pull himself up, but his shoulder was damaged, would not take his full weight. Behind him on the far side of the now uncrossable gap, Ian and Brock stood staring, their flashlights illuminating Blake's struggle. For a moment, Blake thought Ian might try to help, might show some basic humanity, but instead the man just smiled. "Enjoy your tomb, Morrison," Ian called out. "There are dozens of miles of tunnels down here, most of them unmapped. Even if you find another way out, you will freeze before you make it to civilization. And even if by some miracle you survive, who will believe the paranoid veteran and his conspiracy theories over a respected businessman with lawyers and documentation?" Ian turned and walked away, taking his light with him, leaving Blake hanging in darkness. Brock hesitated, looked like he might say something, then followed his boss, and their lights faded, leaving only Felicia's small flashlight and the sound of Blake's labored breathing. Felicia pulled with everything she had. Blake got one elbow onto the ledge, then the other, and finally rolled onto solid ground, lying on his back, gasping, every part of him screaming pain. Felicia was crying, shaking, repeating that she was sorry, that this was her fault. Blake sat up slowly, put his hand on her shoulder. "Not your fault," he said, his voice rough. "This is exactly where we are supposed to be, doing exactly what we are supposed to do. And we are not done yet, not by a long way." Blake took stock of their situation, limited supplies, one flashlight between them, no cell signal, injured, and lost in an unmapped cave system with no clear way back. But they were alive, and they were together. And Blake had been in worse situations, had survived against longer odds. He checked his phone again. Still no signal, but the GPS was tracking, showing a confused maze of passages they had taken. He also had the photos Felicia had taken before Ian arrived, backed up automatically to cloud storage if they ever got signal again. They had evidence, they had purpose, and most importantly, Blake had courage to think about. Ian had the dog, which meant courage was leverage, which meant Ian would keep him alive, and Blake would find a way back, would get his dog, and would make sure these men answered for what they had done. He helped Felicia to her feet, pointed toward the tunnel on their side of the broken bridge. "We go forward," Blake said. "Every tunnel leads somewhere. We find that somewhere, and we find our way out." Felicia nodded, wiped her eyes, and together they moved deeper into the mountain, into darkness and uncertainty, but also toward whatever lay ahead, whatever purpose had brought them to this moment. Behind them the chasm yawned silent and absolute, and ahead the mountain held its secrets close. But Blake Morrison had spent his life breaking through obstacles that seemed impossible, and he was not about to stop now. They walked for hours through passages that twisted and branched like veins in stone, Blake leading with the flashlight held low to conserve battery, Felicia following close behind with one hand on his shoulder for guidance. The temperature dropped steadily as they descended, and Blake could feel the cold seeping through his jacket, into his bones, the kind of deep chill that warned of hypothermia if they did not find warmth soon. His breath came out in white clouds, and he noticed Felicia was shivering despite her layers. They needed to rest, needed to conserve energy. But stopping in this cold without proper gear was nearly as dangerous as continuing. Blake's mind kept circling back to courage, to the sound of the dog yelping in pain, to what Ian and Brock might be doing to him right now. The thought made Blake's jaw clench so hard his teeth ached, but he forced himself to focus on the immediate problem: get Felicia out alive, then deal with everything else. They came to a junction where 3 passages met, and Blake stopped, shining his light down each tunnel, looking for any indication of which might lead towards surface. The air in the leftmost passage felt fractionally warmer, perhaps from geothermal activity, or perhaps from proximity to outside, and Blake chose that direction based on nothing but intuition and 2 decades of learning to trust his gut when information was incomplete. They had gone maybe another 100 yards when they heard it. A sound that did not belong in the silence of stone and darkness. A voice, human, calling out. And it was not Ian or Brock. It was someone else entirely. Blake killed the light immediately, pulled Felicia against the wall, both of them frozen in darkness while they listened. The voice came again, closer now, echoing through the tunnels in a way that made direction impossible to determine, but the words were clear enough. "Morrison, if you can hear me, this is Sam Chen. I am coming to get you out." Blake felt Felicia tense beside him, felt his own surge of hope mixed with suspicion. How did Sam know they were down here? How did Sam even find this place? And most critically, could they trust him, or was this some trap Ian had set using someone Blake had briefly met and might foolishly believe? Blake stayed silent, waited. And then Sam's voice came again. This time with information only the real Sam would know. "Blake, you asked me about old structures when we met. I told you some history is better staying buried. That was a lie. I have been investigating Ian Blackwood for 3 years. I am former FBI, retired. But I never stopped working this case. I followed you and Felicia to the cave entrance this morning. Saw Ian and Brock go in after you. I called for backup and came in myself because I knew they would not wait. I found your dog injured but alive. He is with the paramedics outside, and now I need to find you before this mountain kills you both." Blake made a decision, took a calculated risk, turned on his flashlight and called out. "Sam, we are here. We are trapped on the wrong side of a collapsed bridge. We need guidance." Within minutes, Sam appeared from a side tunnel Blake had not even noticed, the older man carrying a serious backpack, wearing caving gear, and looking remarkably capable for someone Blake had dismissed as just a local woodsman. Sam's face showed relief when he saw them, but also urgency. "We need to move fast," he said. "The temperature is dropping. There is a storm moving in outside, and you two are both showing early signs of hypothermia. I can get you out, but we have to go now." Sam gave them both emergency thermal blankets from his pack, made them drink from bottles of water mixed with electrolyte powder, assessed Blake's injured shoulder with practiced efficiency. "You are lucky you can still move that arm," Sam said. "Rotator cuff is damaged but not torn completely. You will need surgery eventually, but right now we just need to stabilize it." He fashioned a quick sling from webbing, then handed Blake a chemical heat pack to hold against his core. Felicia got the same treatment, and within minutes Blake could feel the shaking begin to subside, his mind clearing from the fog that he only now realized had been clouding his judgment. Sam led them through passages that showed signs of prior exploration, survey markers and rope anchors that suggested Sam had been mapping this system for some time. As they walked, Sam explained in brief sentences broken by the demands of navigation. Ian Blackwood came to the FBI's attention 2 years ago during a money laundering investigation. We had evidence he was using real estate developments to clean money for a criminal organization, but we could never get enough to prosecute before he bought off or intimidated witnesses. I retired 6 months ago, but I kept watching him as a private citizen, kept gathering information. When he started buying up land in this area, I knew he had found something valuable. Either mineral rights or something historical he could exploit. I have been living out here, watching, waiting for him to make a mistake big enough that I could take him down. Today he made that mistake. Assault with a deadly weapon, attempted murder, kidnapping your dog, all witnessed by me, And all more than enough to put him away, even if the fraud charges never stick. Blake asked about Courage, and Sam's expression softened. Your dog is a fighter, he said. Brock shot him with a tranquilizer dart first, tried to use him as bait to draw you back, but the dose was too high for a dog that size. Courage collapsed, and in the chaos when I intervened, they left him behind. I got him out to the paramedics. They transported him to an emergency vet. Last I heard before I lost radio signal was that he was stable, critical, but stable, and they were prepping him for surgery. The news about Courage hit Blake like a physical blow. The relief that the dog was alive, mixing with fury at what had been done to him, at how close they had come to losing each other. Sam must have seen something in Blake's face because he stopped walking, turned to face him directly. Morrison, listen to me, Sam said, his voice hard. You're thinking about going back, about finding Ian and Brock and making them pay. I can see it in your eyes because I have seen it in my own mirror often enough. But right now, the best thing you can do for your dog and for justice is get out of here alive. Give testimony. Let the system work the way it is supposed to work when you have actual evidence and witnesses. Ian is not going anywhere. I have agents waiting at every exit from this mountain. He will be arrested the moment he surfaces. And if he tries to run deeper into the caves, he will die down here because, unlike us, he does not have maps or supplies or experience. Blake wanted to argue, wanted to reject the logic. But he knew Sam was right. Knew that revenge was not the same as justice. Knew that Courage needed him alive and present. Not dead in a cave or arrested for assault. He nodded once, and they kept moving. Following Sam through the maze of stone, climbing when the passages rose, crawling when they narrowed, always moving towards surface and air, and the storm that was coming. They emerged from the cave system 2 hours later through an entrance Blake would never have found on his own. A narrow slot hidden behind a waterfall in a ravine 3 miles from where they had originally entered. Outside, the world had transformed, snow falling thick and fast, the first major storm of winter arriving with a vengeance. Sam led them down a trail marked with reflective tape, and within 20 minutes they reached a command post that the FBI and local search and rescue had established. Vehicles and equipment and people in official jackets who surrounded them immediately with warm blankets and medical attention. Blake was hustled into an ambulance, paramedics checking his vitals and treating his shoulder, but he refused to leave until he had answers. "Where is my dog?" he demanded, and a young FBI agent checked her tablet, made a call, then reported that Courage was out of surgery. The tranquilizer had caused respiratory complications, but the vets had managed to stabilize him. He was sedated and recovering, and Blake could see him as soon as the doctors cleared Blake himself. Felicia was in another ambulance, being treated for hypothermia and exhaustion, but she gave Blake a thumbs up through the window, and he returned it, feeling the weight of shared survival, the bond of people who had faced death together and come through. Sam appeared at the ambulance door, snowflakes caught in his gray hair, looking tired but satisfied. Ian and Brock just emerged from the main cave entrance, Sam said. Walked right into the arrest team. They are in custody, and the cave system is being secured as a crime scene and historical site. Felicia's evidence and testimony about the artifacts will be enough to get it protected status, and my evidence about Ian's threats and actions will be enough to keep him in prison for a very long time. Blake closed his eyes, let relief wash through him, and for the first time in hours allowed himself to believe they had actually won. But the victory felt hollow without Courage. And as soon as the paramedics cleared Blake, he demanded to be taken to the veterinary hospital. Sam drove him personally, the 2 men sitting in silence as the snow continued to fall, covering the mountain and all its secrets in a blanket of white. The vet clinic was small but well equipped, and the staff led Blake to a recovery room where Courage lay on a padded table, an IV line in his leg, monitors beeping steadily, his breathing slow and regular. Blake moved to the dog's side, rested his hand on Courage's head, felt the warmth of living fur, the slight flutter of eyelids as the dog sensed his presence even through sedation. The veterinarian, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and capable hands, explained the situation in terms Blake could understand. The tranquilizer dose was nearly fatal, she said. Combined with the stress and exertion, his respiratory system began to shut down. We had to intubate and ventilate him while his body processed the drugs. But his heart stayed strong. His will to live was remarkable. Honestly, I have seen animals give up with less trauma. But this one fought every second. She smiled at Blake. He was fighting to get back to you. Even unconscious, his body was fighting. That is the power of the bond you two have. And that is what saved his life. Blake felt his throat close up, felt tears he had not shed in years burn behind his eyes, and he did not try to stop them. Just stood there with his hand on his dog, on his partner, on the creature who had led him to purpose and meaning, and nearly died protecting him. Courage woke slowly over the next 6 hours. Blake never leaving his side, refusing offers of food or rest, just sitting in a chair pulled close to the table, talking quietly to the dog, telling him about what had happened, about how they had won, about how Ian and Brock were in custody, about how the fortress was going to be protected, about how none of it mattered compared to Courage being alive. When the dog's eyes finally opened, unfocused at first, then gradually clearing, finding Blake's face and holding it, Blake saw recognition, saw relief, saw love. And he knew that whatever else happened in his life, this moment, this connection, was what he had been looking for all along without knowing it. Courage tried to lift his head, managed a few inches before exhaustion pulled him back down, but his tail moved, a slow, weak wag that made Blake laugh through his tears. "That's right," Blake said. "We made it, buddy. We both made it. And we are going to be okay." The vet checked Courage's vitals again, pronounced herself satisfied with his progress, said he would need several days of observation and recovery, but that he should make a full recovery barring complications. She left them alone, and Blake pulled his chair closer, rested his head on the edge of the table near Courage's paw, and finally allowed himself to sleep, knowing that when he woke up, his dog would still be there, still breathing, still fighting, still his. Sam appeared the next morning with news and coffee. Ian Blackwood was being held without bail, facing federal charges of assault, attempted murder, kidnapping, and a list of financial crimes that Sam's investigation had documented over 3 years. Brock Martinez had immediately turned informant, providing detailed testimony about Ian's criminal organization, the money laundering operation, and the plan to use the resort development to hide the cave system and its contents from authorities. The artifacts Felicia had photographed were being authenticated by experts from the Smithsonian and from the Nez Perce tribe itself, and preliminary analysis confirmed they were genuine sacred objects hidden during the 1877 war, making them both historically and culturally priceless. The fortress itself was being mapped by a team of archaeologists and historians, and the early findings suggested it was built by a rogue army unit that disagreed with the government's treatment of the Nez Perce, soldiers who risked court-martial and execution to help preserve what they saw as innocent people's heritage. It was a story that would rewrite textbooks, challenge accepted narratives, and give voice to complexity and honor in a conflict usually painted in simple terms of conquest and resistance. Felicia was already being interviewed by national media, her grandmother's stories vindicated, her life's work suddenly thrust into spotlight and significance. And Blake, Sam said, was being credited as a hero, a veteran who had risked everything to protect history and justice. Blake shook his head at that, looked at Courage sleeping peacefully under the influence of pain medication. "He is the hero," Blake said quietly. "Not me. Everything good that came from this started with him, with his instincts and his courage and his loyalty. I was just smart enough to follow where he led." 3 days later, Courage was released from the vet hospital, still weak but walking, still needing medication and restricted activity, but alive and alert and unmistakably himself. Blake carried him to the truck, settled him gently on a bed of blankets in the back seat, drove slowly back to the cabin through landscapes transformed by snow. Inside, Blake had prepared everything. A soft bed by the fireplace, food and water within easy reach, every comfort he could provide. He helped Courage settle, built up the fire, and sat beside the dog, both of them staring into the flames, both of them healing. Over the following weeks, as winter deepened and the mountains became impassable except by snowmobile or ski, Blake and Courage recovered together. Blake's shoulder required surgery, as Sam had predicted, and he wore a sling for 6 weeks, learning to be patient with limitation, learning to accept help from neighbors who suddenly appeared with casseroles and offers to shovel snow and check on him. Felicia visited often, bringing news of the ongoing investigation and the plans for the fortress, which was being designated as a National Historic Site with input from the Nez Perce Nation on how it should be preserved and interpreted. She had been offered a position as the site's historian, a dream job that would allow her to continue her grandmother's legacy and ensure the true story was told. Sam visited too, officially retired now but clearly energized by the successful case, talking about writing a book, about the satisfaction of finally bringing Ian Blackwood to justice after years of watching him operate with impunity. And through it all, Courage was there, slowly regaining strength. The bond between dog and man deeper now for having been tested and proven unbreakable. One evening, as Blake sat by the fire with Courage's head resting on his lap, he thought about how much had changed in just a few months. He had come to this mountain to hide, to escape memories and pain, to exist in isolation where nothing could touch him. What he found instead was purpose, was connection, was a reason to fight and a partner to fight beside. Courage had led him to the fortress, but more than that, the dog had led him back to himself, to the part of Blake that still believed things mattered, that justice was worth pursuing, that loyalty and courage were not just military values, but fundamental truths about how to live with meaning. Blake ran his hand through Courage's fur, felt the dog's breathing, steady and strong, felt gratitude so profound it was almost painful. "You saved me," Blake whispered to the sleeping dog, "before I ever saved you. You saved me from disappearing, from giving up, from believing the best parts of my life were behind me, and I will never forget that. I will spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of your loyalty and your love." Courage stirred, opened one eye, looked at Blake with that profound understanding that required no words, then settled back to sleep, secure in the knowledge that they were together, they were safe, and they were home. The spring came eventually, as it always does, the snow melting to reveal landscapes reborn. Blake and Courage walked the trails again, both fully healed now, both stronger for what they had endured. The fortress was officially opened to the public with a ceremony that brought together veterans, members of the Nez Perce Nation, historians, and local families whose ancestors had been part of the hidden story. Blake was asked to speak, and he stood at the podium with Courage beside him, looking out at the crowd, searching for words adequate to the moment. "What I learned in that darkness," Blake said, "is that heroism is not about fearlessness. Heroism is about standing up for what is right, even when you are terrified, even when the cost is high, even when it would be easier to walk away. And sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who walk on 4 legs, who cannot speak but communicate through action, who teach us by example what loyalty and courage and unconditional love actually mean." This fortress was hidden for nearly 150 years, a testament to soldiers who chose conscience over orders, who protected rather than destroyed. And it was found because one German shepherd refused to let history stay buried, because one rescue dog rescued not just me but the truth itself. Blake looked down at Courage, who looked back with those dark, intelligent eyes, and the crowd erupted in applause. But Blake barely heard it, because in that moment he and the dog were alone together in their shared understanding, in the unbreakable bond forged in darkness and danger, in the knowledge that they had found each other exactly when they both needed it most, and that nothing in life was random. Everything led here, to this moment, to this meaning, to this profound and perfect sense of home. The months following the fortress discovery transformed into a journey of healing and purpose that Blake could not have imagined when he first retreated to his isolated cabin. Spring brought not just the melting of snow, but the thawing of something deeper within him, a sense of connection to the world that extended beyond his bond with courage. The trial of Ian Blackwood became regional news, and with it came attention that Blake initially resisted, but gradually learned to channel toward meaningful ends. Reporters wanted to interview him, veterans groups invited him to speak, and most unexpectedly, the Veterans Administration contacted him about a pilot program they were developing. Blake met with a VA psychologist named Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had been studying the therapeutic effects of dogs on combat-related PTSD for over a decade. She explained that while emotional support animals were common, properly trained psychiatric service dogs specifically for veterans were still relatively rare, and the success stories were compelling. She had read about Blake and Courage, about how their partnership had not only survived extreme danger, but had given Blake purpose and meaning that traditional therapy had struggled to provide. Dr. Martinez asked Blake a question that would redirect the course of his life. Would you consider helping us develop a training program that pairs rescue dogs with veterans, using your experience and Courage's demonstrated abilities as a foundation? Blake looked at Courage, who was lying beside his chair in Dr. Martinez's office, the dog's eyes alert despite the months of recovery behind them, and he felt something click into place, the sense that everything they had been through was leading exactly here, to this moment where their story could become part of something larger than themselves. By summer, Blake had moved from isolated cabin dweller to active participant in building what they called the Courage Project, a program that would rescue dogs from shelters, evaluate them for temperament and trainability, then match them with veterans struggling with PTSD, anxiety, and the profound disconnection that often followed military service. Blake partnered with professional dog trainers, with VA therapists, and with other veterans who had found healing through canine companionship. Courage became the program's ambassador, his story inspiring donors and participants, his presence at training sessions a living example of what was possible. Blake discovered he had a gift for working with both the dogs and the veterans, his military experience giving him credibility, his honesty about his own struggles giving him authenticity, and his deep bond with Courage giving him a model to share. He worked with a young Marine named Carlos, who had lost both legs in an IED blast and could not leave his apartment without panic attacks, until a German shepherd named Atlas learned to create space around Carlos in crowds, to interrupt flashbacks with physical pressure, to be the anchor that allowed Carlos to rejoin the world. He worked with a female Army medic named Jennifer, who had nightmares so severe she was afraid to sleep, until a rescue mutt named Hope learned to wake her gently, to stand guard while she slept, to be the presence that made rest possible again. Each success felt personal to Blake. Each veteran who found their way back through the help of a dog validated not just the program, but the entire journey that had led him here. Felicia's work with the fortress proceeded in parallel, and by late summer she invited Blake and Courage to the official dedication ceremony that would mark the site's transformation from hidden cave to protected National Historic Site. The ceremony was scheduled for early September, time to coincide with the anniversary of Chief Joseph's final surrender in 1877, a deliberate choice to honor the end of one story and the beginning of another. Blake drove to the site on a clear morning that smelled of pine and autumn, Courage riding beside him with his head out of the window, ears back in the wind, looking like the picture of canine contentment. The parking area that had been a rough pullout was now paved and landscaped, with interpretive signs explaining the historical significance. A wooden boardwalk led from the parking area to the cave entrance, designed to protect the fragile ecosystem while allowing public access. Several hundred people had gathered for the ceremony, a mix of Nez Perce tribal members in traditional regalia, government officials in suits, veterans in uniform, local families, and media crews with cameras. Blake felt momentarily overwhelmed by the crowd, his old instincts toward isolation rising, but courage pressed against his leg, a familiar comfort, and Blake breathed through the anxiety, reminded himself why he was here, why this mattered. Felicia found them in the crowd, embraced Blake warmly, scratched Courage behind the ears with the familiarity of friendship, and led them toward the front where seats had been reserved. The ceremony began with traditional Nez Perce songs and drumming that resonated through the mountains like a conversation with ancestors, voices carrying across generations and grief to this moment of recognition and healing. Tribal elders spoke about the significance of the artifacts that had been recovered, sacred objects that represented not just history, but living culture, items that would be repatriated to the tribe and displayed in a new cultural center being built with funds that Ian Blackwood's seized assets had provided, a poetic justice that Blake appreciated. A representative from the National Park Service formally declared the site protected, explaining the archaeological and historical importance, the evidence of cooperation between soldiers and native people that challenged simplistic narratives of the Indian Wars period. Then Felicia spoke, her voice strong and clear, telling the story of her grandmother, of the legends passed down through generations, of the moment Blake and Courage had walked into her library with a tarnished medal and set in motion a chain of events that had recovered not just artifacts, but dignity, not just history, but truth. She called Blake to the podium, and he walked forward with Courage at his side, aware of hundreds of eyes on them, aware that what he said here would matter, would be recorded, would become part of the story. "I am not good at speeches," Blake began, earning a few sympathetic chuckles. "But I know what it means to be lost, to feel like the world has no place for you anymore, to wake up every day wondering what the point is. I came to these mountains to disappear, to hide from memories and pain, to exist in a kind of limbo that was not living, but was not quite dying either. What I found instead was purpose, but I did not find it alone. I found it because one rescue dog refused to let me stay lost, because Courage led me to something bigger than my own pain, to history that needed uncovering, to injustice that needed addressing, to connections that needed making." Blake paused, reached down to rest his hand on Courage's head, felt the solid warmth of the dog's presence. This fortress was built by soldiers who chose conscience over orders, who saw people suffering and decided to help, even though helping could cost them everything. That took courage, real courage, the kind that does not come from fearlessness, but from acting despite fear, from standing up when sitting down would be easier, from protecting what matters even when the cost is high. And that is what Courage taught me. Not the abstract concept, but the lived reality, by leading me here, by protecting me when I was threatened, by literally taking a bullet meant for me, by fighting to survive so we could finish what we started together. Blake's voice caught slightly, and he cleared his throat, pushed through. "We call them service dogs, therapy dogs, working dogs. But those labels do not capture what they really are. They are healers, teachers, bridges back to ourselves. And sometimes they are heroes in the truest sense, beings who give everything without asking for anything except our love and loyalty in return." This site honors soldiers who protected the Nez Perce people, and that is right and necessary. But I also want to honor the four-legged warriors who protect us, who serve without choice, who show us daily what unconditional love and absolute courage actually look like. Blake looked down at Courage, who looked back with those deep, intelligent eyes, and the crowd erupted in applause. After the speeches, there was a reception in a large tent where food was served and people mingled, sharing stories and building connections. Blake found himself surrounded by veterans who wanted to talk about their own dogs, about their own struggles, about their interest in the Courage Project. He exchanged contact information, made plans for follow-up conversations, felt the strange new reality of being part of a community rather than isolated from it. A Nez Perce elder named Thomas approached Blake, introduced himself as Felicia's uncle, and asked if they could speak privately for a moment. They walked a short distance from the tent, Courage trailing along, and Thomas stopped at a place where they could see the cave entrance and the mountains rising behind it. Thomas spoke slowly, thoughtfully, in the manner of someone choosing words with care. My people have a tradition of honoring those who help us, who stand with us when others turn away. What you and your dog did, uncovering this place, protecting these sacred objects, fighting men who would have destroyed it all for money, that is the kind of action that matters across generations. The tribe has decided to honor you both at our winter gathering, and we would like to give Courage a name in our language, if you would permit it. Blake felt humbled, uncertain how to respond to such an offer. Thomas continued. We would call him Waiakin. It means guardian spirit, the protective force that guides and protects. It is a sacred concept for our people. And your dog embodies it. Blake looked at Courage, tried the name quietly, Waiakin, and the dog's ears perked up as if recognizing something true about himself. Blake turned back to Thomas, his throat tight with emotion. We would be honored, Blake said simply. And Thomas smiled, placed a hand briefly on Blake's shoulder, a gesture of respect and recognition, then walked back toward the gathering. As the afternoon lengthened into evening and the crowd began to disperse, Blake and Courage walked one final time to the cave entrance, now protected by a gate that would allow supervised access while preventing vandalism or theft. Blake stood looking into the darkness beyond the gate, remembering the terror and confusion of being hunted through those passages, remembering the cold and pain and fear, but also remembering the clarity of purpose, the absolute certainty that what they were doing mattered, that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. Felicia joined him, stood silent for a moment before speaking. I have been thinking about what you said in your speech, about courage leading you to purpose. I think maybe we all need that. Something or someone who refuses to let us stay lost, who pulls us toward what we are supposed to be doing, even when we resist. For me, it was my grandmother's stories. For you, it was courage. For the soldiers who built this fortress, it was their conscience. But it is all the same thing, really. That call toward meaning, toward standing for something larger than ourselves. Blake nodded, appreciated her insight, appreciated the friendship that had formed through shared danger and shared purpose. They stood together watching the sun drop toward the horizon, painting the mountains in gold and amber light, while courage sat between them, head high, alert to the wind and the world, a perfect embodiment of presence and awareness. Eventually, they walked back to their vehicles, said their goodbyes, made promises to stay in touch that Blake knew they would keep. And Blake drove home through the mountain roads with Courage beside him, both of them tired but satisfied, both of them transformed by everything they had experienced and survived together. The final piece of their story came in October, when the American Humane Society contacted Blake about nominating Courage for their Hero Dog Awards, specifically the category for therapy dogs that had demonstrated extraordinary impact on human lives. Blake filled out the lengthy application, provided documentation of Courage's actions during the Fortress incident and his subsequent work with the Courage Project, submitted testimonials from veterans whose lives had been changed by meeting Courage and seeing what was possible. In November, Blake received notification that Courage had been selected as a finalist, and in December they were invited to a ceremony in Los Angeles where the winners would be announced. Blake had never been comfortable with attention or pageantry, but this felt different. This was about honoring courage, about recognizing the contribution of service animals broadly, and Blake would endure any amount of personal discomfort for that. They flew to Los Angeles. Blake's first time on a plane since leaving the military. Courage certified as a psychiatric service dog, which allowed him to fly in the cabin. The ceremony was held in a hotel ballroom filled with celebrities and dignitaries, and other extraordinary dogs with their handlers, each one representing a story of courage and loyalty and impact. When Courage's category was announced, Blake held his breath, not because winning mattered in any competitive sense, but because recognition mattered. Validation of what dogs like Courage contributed to the world mattered. The presenter opened the envelope, read the name, and Blake heard through the rushing in his ears, "The Hero Therapy Dog Award goes to Courage, handled by Blake Morrison, for extraordinary bravery in protecting his handler during a life-threatening situation, and for subsequent work helping combat veterans heal from PTSD through the Courage Project." Blake stood, legs shaking slightly, walked to the stage with Courage beside him, accepted a medal that was placed around the dog's neck, posed for photos, and gave a very brief speech thanking everyone who supported service dogs and asking people to consider adopting rescue dogs and supporting veteran programs. Back home in the mountains, life settled into a new rhythm that was busy but fulfilling, purposeful in ways Blake had not experienced since leaving the military. The Courage Project expanded, serving more veterans, rescuing more dogs, building partnerships with VA facilities across the region. Blake hired staff, secured grants, developed training protocols, and saw the program grow beyond what he could have imagined that day when Dr. Martinez first asked if he would help. Through it all, Courage was his constant companion, his partner, his reminder of why this work mattered. They still took their morning walks through the forest, still sat by the fire in the evenings, still had those moments of perfect understanding that required no words. But now their walks often included other veterans and their dogs, and their evenings sometimes included planning sessions or training reviews, and their shared understanding had expanded to encompass a purpose that served others. Blake thought often about the journey that had brought them here, about how finding that medal had started everything, how following Courage's instincts had led to uncovering history and confronting evil, and ultimately finding redemption. He thought about the fortress soldiers who had risked everything to protect what they believed was right, about the Nez Perce people who had endured so much loss but maintained their culture and dignity, about Ian Blackwood rotting in federal prison because greed had made him believe he was above consequences, about Sam Chen, who had never stopped pursuing justice, even after retiring, about Felicia, who had honored her grandmother's legacy by bringing truth to light. All of these threads woven together into a story that mattered, that would be remembered, that had changed lives, including and especially his own. On a quiet evening in late December, Blake sat by the fire with Courage's head in his lap, the dog drowsing while Blake ran his fingers through the thick fur, thinking about the year that had passed and the years ahead. Outside, snow fell soft and steady, covering the world in silence and peace. Inside, the fire crackled and popped, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. Blake thought about all the veterans he had worked with who were finding their way back. Thought about all the dogs who had been given second chances through the rescue program. Thought about how suffering could transform into purpose if you let it. If you stayed open to where life was trying to lead you. He leaned down, spoke quietly to Courage, even though the dog was mostly asleep. "You saved me," Blake said. Not just from Ian Blackwood or from dying in a cave, but from a life of isolation and meaninglessness. From giving up on the idea that I could still matter, still contribute, still be part of something good, art. Everything we have now, all these veterans we are helping, all these dogs we are saving, all this purpose and connection and healing, it all started because you refused to let me stay lost. Because you led me to that fortress and to everything that followed. Blake paused, his voice thick with emotion. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your loyalty and love, trying to honor what you have taught me about courage and resilience and the power of standing up for what matters." Courage stirred slightly, opened one eye to look at Blake, and Blake could swear the dog understood every word, could swear he saw recognition and contentment in that gaze, the deep satisfaction of a mission accomplished, of a purpose fulfilled, of a bond that would endure whatever came next. Blake Morrison had learned that heroism was not about fearlessness or superhuman ability. It was about making the choice to act when action was needed, to protect when protection was required, to stand firm when everything urged you to run. He had learned that the strongest bonds were forged not in comfort, but in crisis, not in ease, but in adversity, not in safety, but in the willingness to risk everything for someone you loved. He had learned that redemption was possible, that purpose could be found even after the darkest periods, that community and connection were not weaknesses, but strengths. And he had learned all of this from a rescue dog who had needed rescuing himself, from a German shepherd who had led him through darkness to light, from a companion whose courage had revealed and inspired his own. The story of the Forgotten Fortress would be told for generations, would change how people understood a painful period of history, would give voice to nuance and honor where simplicity and condemnation had ruled. But for Blake, the real story, the one that mattered most deeply, was simpler and more profound. It was the story of two lost souls who found each other exactly when they needed each other most, who faced impossible odds and survived, who transformed suffering into service and pain into purpose, who proved daily that love and loyalty were not just feelings, but choices, actions, commitments that could change everything. As the fire burned low and the snow continued to fall and courage slept peacefully beside him, Blake felt something he had not felt in years, something he had thought lost forever in the deserts of war and the confusion of coming home. He felt at peace. He felt grateful. He felt whole. And in the morning, they would wake and continue the work, helping others find what they had found, sharing the gift they had been given, honoring the bond that had saved them both. We would love to hear your story. Have you ever been saved by a loyal friend, whether on 2 legs or 4? Share your experience in the comments below, and let's honor these everyday heroes together. If stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances touch your heart, subscribe to our channel. Every week, we share true tales of veterans and their incredible dogs who prove that the strongest bonds are forged in the toughest battles. The next story waiting for you on screen right now will show you another unbelievable journey of faith and survival. Click it now, and thank you for honoring our veterans and their faithful companions. To all who served and the dogs who stand beside them, we salute you.